So there's been a troubling incident at the Chinese consulate in Manchester. I'm just going to read out the BBC report. It's always important in these things to have the details, so I'm just going to read it out, so bear with me. I'll put a link in the video because there's actually a video in the link as well. So I'm just going to read this out. This was reported yesterday, and the report's by Loch Lee at the consulate in Manchester and Elsa Masham in London. A Hong Kong pro-democracy protester was pulled into Chinese consulate grounds in Manchester on Sunday and beaten up. Unidentified men came out of the consulate and forced a man inside the compound before he escaped with the help of police and other demonstrators. Forced into the compound, this is very significant. The protester told the BBC, "They dragged me inside, they beat me up." The UK government called the reports extremely concerning. The consulate says protesters displayed an insulting portrait of China's president. Foreign Office said it was urgently seeking clarity on the incident. Greater Manchester Police has launched an investigation. Speaking after the incident, the protester called Bob told BBC Chinese that mainlanders, people from mainland China, as opposed to Hong Kong, had come out of the consulate and destroyed their posters. As we tried to stop them, they dragged me inside, they beat me up, he said, adding that he was then pulled out by the UK police. Um, it's ridiculous. The attackers, shouldn't have done that. We are supposed to have freedom to say whatever we want here in the UK. After the incident, the crowd remained angry. Protesters shouted at the man from the consulate and the British police, arguing they should have done more. From what I've seen, that's a bit unfair on the police. Um, Consulate staff had previously asked the protesters to move to the opposite side of the street. There were two police officers at the protest, but several more appeared within minutes of the altercation beginning. They gathered at the gates of the compound trying to break up the fighting and move protesters back. One police officer entered the consulate grounds and pulled the man who had been dragged inside back out. At least 8 men, some of whom were wearing helmets and protective vests, then returned to the consulate building. The consulate is on UK soil but cannot be entered without consent. Reacting on Twitter, former Conservative leader Ian Duncan Smith said the UK government should demand a full apology from the Chinese ambassador and that those involved should be sent back to China. Protests outside embassies and consulates in Britain often involve a few scuffles. Police are often at hand to keep the peace, but rarely do consulate staff emerge onto the street to pull down banners and posters, and even more rarely are protesters dragged through the gates and apparently beaten up. So it's not surprising there are growing calls for the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly to summon China's ambassador in Britain for an explanation. Labour's Foreign Affairs spokesman David Lammy said the alleged assault was unacceptable. Quashing of peaceful protests will never be tolerated on our streets, he said. The police and the Home Office will investigate first and decide what action to take, if any, from a criminal justice point of view. As for the Foreign Office, it will have to decide whether to make any diplomatic response. Britain is, of course, a signatory to the Vienna Convention, which gives some diplomatic immunity to consular staff and their properties, but diplomats and their employees are still covered by UK law and could potentially be declared persona non grata by the British government. President Xi Jinping, who is set to secure a third term in power, said he had turned the situation in Hong Kong from chaos to governance, referring to China's suppression of pro-democracy protests there. A spokesperson for the consulate said the protesters had hung an insulting portrait of the Chinese president at the main entrance. The portrait actually showed Xi Jinping being hanged, so it was, I guess, provocative, but this would be intolerable and unacceptable for any diplomatic and consular missions of any country. Therefore, we condemn this deplorable act with strong indignation and firm opposition, the spokesperson added. A spokesperson said Greater Manchester Police was aware of the incident. Officers were present and responded immediately to defuse the situation. They said inquiries are ongoing at this time to understand the full circumstances. Downing Street said these reports are extremely concerning. I understand Greater Manchester Police responded immediately to the incident and I'm conscious their inquiries are ongoing, so it would be inappropriate for me to comment beyond that, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson said. Okay, there's a number of things to say about this incident. Firstly, the protester who was attacked, that's not hyperbole. You could see the marks on his face. It looks like he's been quite badly beaten up. Um, From the footage that is available, it's about 2 minutes long. You could clearly see this guy being dragged into the compound. and you can clearly see the police are trying to help him and pull him back. You can clearly see masked individuals rushing over and kicking the placards and the signs. And then there's a bit of scuffling going on. It isn't entirely clear exactly what's happening, but it is clear that this guy was dragged into the compound. Now, from what I can see, or from what I would gather, this is extremely manipulative of the Chinese consulate. What they're trying to do is, I think, because that's technically Chinese ground, they're going to get into the situation where they'll accuse the police, Greater Manchester Police, of violating Chinese sovereignty. If this thing escalates, there's a lot going on at the moment, so I don't know how much coverage it's going to get. But if it does escalate, if Cleverly calls the Chinese ambassador in for an explanation, then I imagine the Chinese are going to claim that their sovereignty was threatened. Um, but I hope that Cleverly, I mean, it is absolutely right that they wait for the investigation. You can't just go in gung ho and accuse the Chinese of. I mean, it's blatantly obvious, but of course they have to, be absolutely sure about the facts. Um, because the Chinese are very, very manipulative of this. These CCP hawks, they're very good at being manipulative. Not long ago, young Australian activist Drew Pavlo was accused of sending a bomb threat to the Chinese embassy in London. Now, the Metropolitan Police are still investigating him. He's back in Australia. His lawyers are still working on the case. He's robustly denied this, and his lawyers have called on the Met to look into the IP address of that email, which would show it did not come from his laptop. It did not come from him. It's very, very plausible that it came from pro-Beijing sources in a way to basically set him up, to make him look like an extremist, to make him look like a terrorist. Um, these CCP thugs are very capable of doing that. And this is a new thing, what's happened in Manchester. There's long been tensions outside embassies where you have protesters and they'll they'll protest, they'll have placards and so on. And as we know, there's been some history in this country of clashes between mainlanders and Hong Kongers, or between mainlanders and CCP critics. I've quoted this before. We saw it in the lead up to the Beijing 2008 Olympics. We saw it not last year, the around 2020, 2019, 2020, when Hong Kong students were violently threatened in British universities by mainland students. Um, so there's empirical evidence of this going on. But this is the first time where embassy staff have actually got physically involved in an altercation, from what I can tell. So it's an escalation. Um, it shows how thin-skinned they are, but it also shows that they think that they can behave this way in another country. Now, obviously, the protesters should be responsible. If they had, for example, entered into the compound, then unfortunately, it is technically true. We have to give the Chinese assurance that their staff will not be at any physical risk of any physical threat, as contemptible as they are. That's a point about diplomacy, because otherwise they would just turn a blind eye to British embassy staff being threatened in Beijing. So that's something that's understood around the world. Um, and even, when countries have very frosty relations, that is a very basic point about diplomacy. Um, so we need to be careful with that. But if it is proven that this young man was indeed dragged in, and I think it's quite obvious from the video that that's what happened, then I think that the officers, I think, were absolutely right to protect him. Um, and if the Chinese try to accuse these officers of, violating their sovereignty, I really hope they can testify and say, well, actually, this is what happened. And I think they should be. I mean, in Duncan Smith's proposal that they be expelled, I agree with it, but I don't think it's going to happen. Unfortunately, the Truss government's in a very weak position at the moment domestically, obviously with everything that's going on. So they may not want a diplomatic crisis on top of this. She may be just focusing on the economy right now and kind of damage limitation. But issues like this should be above party politics. And I'm pleased that David Lammy has taken a hard line. Um, him and Cleverly should be on the same page with this, because when it comes to national security, when it comes to a rogue regime like the CCP, we can't play party politics. So there should be an investigation, but it should be done very quickly. And I think right now, I hope what is happening is Greater Manchester Police is corresponding closely with the Foreign Office, because this isn't just a domestic issue, because it involves the foreign government. This is actually an issue of national security. So I think they should be really in close communication right now. I hope James Cleverly is on the case. And if it emerges that this young man was dragged in against his will, then I think basically those embassy staff should be expelled, because what they're trying to do is manipulate the situation to say that the protesters were being aggressive and trying to invade the compound. Now, having insulting placards is not a reason to beat someone up. Um, they might well accuse the protesters of something, but the evidence will have to speak for itself. The police there were present, so those police are very important. Incidentally, I think it's a bit unfair of the protesters to accuse the police of not doing enough. They have to understand that the police cannot simply enter the compound. They must know that. The police can't do that. From what I could tell, those officers were trying their level best to do what they could. Granted, it's a 2-minute video, there may be more before this. But it's very concerning. Um, the antics of CCP thugs around the world, when they had the incident on the Hong Kong transit system a few years ago, when you had masked thugs literally attack young protesters, violently attack them. This is what they engage in. And these people are not always, diplomats themselves. They're probably hired by Beijing to, um, intimidate protesters. Of course, the caveat is protesters should be responsible, not engage in vandalism or violence, but simply having placards outside the embassy, that's legitimate. As long as they're not entering the embassy, they have a legal right to do that. That must be protected. Um, as for, the embassy's response, that just shows a sheer arrogance. When the footage clearly shows this young man being dragged in, it's not like the protesters tried to storm the embassy. They dragged him in. So I really hope the Foreign Office views this video, speaks to the police involved, and then raises this and see what excuses they come up with. If they are going to come out with barefaced lies, because the video speaks for itself. If I was James Cleverly, I would be saying to the ambassador, how do you explain this? How do you explain the fact that your staff dragged this man inside the compound? How do you explain it? And if he doesn't come up with a satisfactory answer, I really think we're at the point where we need to accept that we don't have close relations with China. Um, Maybe not expel the ambassador, but certainly some of his staff. Certainly those thugs that were involved in beating up this young man, they should be charged with assault, and there shouldn't be any diplomatic immunity. So, needs to be taken seriously. Now, finally, on the issue of protest, I've been fiercely critical of the Eco lot. I mean, one of their most recent activist stunts, two of them got onto the Queen Elizabeth II bridge. I'm not sure where that is actually. But anyway, they got 6-hour tailbacks. Now, to me, that's an act of sabotage, and I hope they face prison time, because you're disrupting thousands and thousands of people. I do think that some of the Hong Kong protesters at the height of the protests in 2019 did do stupid things, engaging in vandalism and some acts of violence. That was after months of peaceful protests. So um, basically, the CCP cannot be trusted. They're barefaced liars, and they have a long track record of lies. So I think we should take a hard line with this. And if the embassy if the consulate tries to lie about it, they should be shown the evidence. How do they explain that? Because I have no doubt that they're going to try and distort this. They're going to try and say they felt threatened and that the protesters were threatening them or something like that, when all the signs are it was a peaceful protest. Provocative, maybe. I mean, the placard, it showed basically Xi Jinping hanging, but I don't see any evidence they were posing a physical threat, like they were threatening to attack the consulate or anything like that. If they were, it would be very stupid because they know the situation. They know that that consulate is diplomatically protected, but they have a right to express anger and dissent. In China, they'd be, beaten up and sent off to a black prison. There was actually a protest in Beijing. A banner was held apparently over a bridge in Beijing, saying "Down with the CCP" and Xi Jinping. But that's extremely rare, and in mainland China, protesters are simply dragged away. It's so where there is freedom in this country to protest peacefully, which means not engaging in vandalism, not engaging in violence, and not, by the way, disrupting the public. That's what's different. These people aren't gluing their hands to roads and disrupting the British public. If they did, it would be very stupid because then the British public would turn against them, as they've turned against the eco activists. But um, I think we need to take this very seriously because there's a new escalation. And I also think with the ongoing case of Drew Pavlo in London, the Met should, just use common sense. They should look up the IP address. If that turns out to be from a Chinese source, that's yet another thing to grill the Chinese ambassador on. Why are they engaging in basically perverting the course of justice, falsely accusing an activist of terrorism? I think all of these things would be ground for expelling diplomats. And if both those things can be proven, I think we're at a point where we may have to expel the Chinese ambassador. It would be a big escalation. And I accept that China's not Russia. China has much more economic clout. So I accept it would be a very difficult decision for the government to make. But we cannot have a situation where these thugs think they can push us around and do what they want on British soil. Think if um, think if you had a situation where British embassy staff pulled Chinese nationals inside the British embassy and beat them up. It would be, you'd have massive protests in China against the foreign colonizers. So I don't think we should tolerate this.